Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to your morning briefing for Monday, the 12th of May, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Let's go ahead and start with Inside the Beltway. Robert, good morning. All right. So, yesterday we heard about this big executive order that's being signed, I believe, roughly right now on prescription drugs. Trump says he's going to cut prescription drug prices by 30 to 80%. Just briefly, what's going on?
Good morning, Mike. Yeah, Trump said that he's going to institute what he called a most favored nations policy. And the idea is to bring U.S. drug prices in line with the drug prices that foreign countries pay. There weren't any details, and I'm going to keep an eye out for that executive order today to see how this is actually going to be implemented.
Mm-hmm. All right. So basically, he's forcing these pharmaceutical companies to sell drugs in the United States at the same price, roughly, that they are sold overseas for.
Yeah, that seems to be the speculation. Bill Ackman is taking credit for this idea. I think he said in 2024 that Trump should basically make it illegal for drug companies to sell for lower prices overseas, and that the effect would be cheaper prices in the U.S. and more expensive prices abroad.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then I've heard a number of, especially on the left and the libertarian right, say these are price controls. This is something that the federal government should not do, which is set prices for certain goods. I would tend to agree. These do not appear, this does not appear exactly like, I don't think this is explicitly a price control. Have you seen, you have a take on that?
Well, though I think the mechanism they're likely to use is similar to what is already done for Medicare and Medicaid, where the government negotiates prices for those covered programs. They might try to use a similar mechanism to negotiate those prices, and possibly some type of export control on those drugs.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then last point here, I've also seen a number of people in reaction to this say big pharma is going to get nuked because they're either going to be forced to increase their prices abroad, or they're going to lose out on a lot of profits, because that's my understanding. A lot of these pharmaceutical companies, the argument rather, is pharmaceutical companies are exploiting the United States by charging higher prices here so they can sell drugs and be more competitive overseas. Is this what we're looking at here?
I think there's the potential there. There's also the possibility that they'll take some of those costs out of research and development, because the other explanation from pharma companies is that they use the higher prices in the U.S. to fund research for new drugs. So they could take a hit there instead, and so we'd get cheaper pharmaceuticals and less innovation.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then actually, this is the last point. On the campaign trail, President Trump was talking about the middleman in between the customer and the pharmaceutical companies. And he basically said, we're going to say bye bye to the middleman. And the same day, the CVS stock dropped by 5% or something like that. Because that's exactly the pharmacy benefit managers taking out the middleman. It seems to me like some people are saying that is the real problem. That's where the real markup comes. And I actually think Mark Cuban was talking about this. He's got this generic low cost drug. I forget even what it's called, but he's trying to compete here. And he was saying the PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers, are the ones that actually jack up the price. And he says they will not even tell you what their wholesale cost is on these drugs, because they jack the rates up so high for retail sales. Have you seen anything like that?
Well, Trump's been railing against the PBM since his first administration, and he's talked about it already, trying to get rid of the pharmacy benefit managers. I think the last time he tried to do something like this, there was a lawsuit, and Trump lost in the federal courts, but that was near the election, and the Biden administration didn't appeal. So I think that it could be part of this, is trying to eliminate those PBM positions at these how they act as a, like you said, a middleman between the drug manufacturers and prescription buyers, Americans, and that could be part of this, is eliminating those, because that would, I think, as he said, drop the price immediately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Frozen Nomad says, so it sounds more akin to busting up a cartel. as opposed to price controls. I would generally agree, but we'll wait for the details. Thanks, Robert. Let's move on here. ICE is trying to, they're negotiating with Mexico or something to try to increase deportation flights.
Yeah, they want to do 9 deportation flights this week. The average is usually 1 a week. The Mexican officials are saying that they're having trouble keeping up with these repatriations, and apparently only about a third of the deportees are actually checking into these welcome centers that the Mexican government established along the border. They said 2/3 are either not showing up, they're bypassing the welcome centers, or just being flown deeper into Mexico.
All right, so 1 deportation flight per week to Mexico. How many people are on a deportation flight? 150 to 300?
I don't know the specific number. It would depend on the aircraft, but I don't think it'd be unreasonable to say 150 to 200.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, those are rookie numbers. We got to get those numbers up. All right, let's move on and talk about President Donald Trump is headed to the Middle East this week. He will be meeting with leaders in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and United Arab Emirates to talk about a number of things. One of those things is increasing foreign direct investment into the United States, trying to get foreign money to fund U.S. infrastructure and energy projects as well. And on this topic, Jared, I think you let's talk about this. On Friday's show, we talked about this little diplomatic rupture here between the United States and Israel. President Trump is going to the Middle East. He will not be visiting Israel. At least that's not on his schedule. And this has to do with a breakdown in diplomacy or diplomatic relations with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu, over the weekend, we heard that he said Israel's going to have to, quote unquote, detox from U.S. security assistance. And basically it sounds like he's telling the Israeli leaders to prepare for a future without U.S. security guarantees. On this topic, do we have any updates from your end on the global sitrep?
Yes, we'll get into all of the updates, but I did see that Israeli media is also claiming that Israel believes Trump's going to recognize the Palestinian state, which would be an incredible deviation from the norm. I haven't been able to find the exact source on where that is. Everybody's kind of citing each other, but nevertheless, it seems that they do all believe, yeah, Palestine's going to be recognized. Probably the biggest update is the American citizen that was released from Hamas. That's actually, I think that's pretty significant because of who it is. That basically means that America no longer has any reason to be involved in the conflict against Hamas. Now everybody that's left is Israeli. It's only an Israeli problem. And that really highlights that bifurcation in the American-Israeli relationship that we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Interesting. Yeah, there's a kind of a grand strategic thing going on as well in the background. I'll bring you back on, Jared, to talk about that. For now, let's move on. There's nothing significant to report for hearings today. So let's talk about this U.S.-China trade deal. I would say this is not, to me, it does not really look like a trade deal so much as it is just another pause. Still, Treasury Secretary Bessent and Trade Representative Jameson Greer released a joint statement over the weekend that a trade deal with China had been reached. The U.S. and China both agreed to a 90-day pause of tariff rates that begins on the 14th of May. The U.S. is going to drop their tariffs from 145% down to 30%. China drops theirs from 125% to 10%. And the two countries have agreed to hold further talks on normalizing trade conditions. And really the biggest thing here, Jared, both countries are talking about avoiding a decoupling scenario. So again, this is more of a pause than a trade deal, but trade deal TBA. Also, it's important both sides are claiming this as a win. A couple of things here before we get into the grand strategic thing. There is a U.S. lawsuit right now in the International Court of Trade or something like that. It is over the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. That is the act that President Trump invoked when he launched this trade war. And that is scheduled for a hearing tomorrow. So this is a U.S. federal court that could issue a nationwide injunction on these tariffs And that would, of course, impose another challenge to this whole strategy. I would call everyone's attention to the map here. This is from Bloomberg. This is the economies that are the focus of these tariff talks right now. I would point you to the blobs of blue over there in the Indo-Pacific. We get roughly 40% of U.S. imports from the Indo-Pacific. That's more like 70 or 80% of these major trade deals that the Trump administration is working on. Jared, we see here, we've got India, we got Australia, and we got Japan. That's the quad, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So this really looks like it is extremely targeted towards the Indo-Pacific, aka China. What are your observations?
I see a couple of big ones. First off, Vietnam's on there. Vietnam is not, they're part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, but they are still technically neutral. Cambodia's on there. And Cambodia is supposed to be much, much closer to China. But a notable exception is Thailand. Thailand, I actually just recently found this out, but we actually do have a mutual defense treaty with Thailand. So the fact that they're not on there, I find very interesting. It may be that there's not as much of a trade deficit there. Obviously, the Philippines is not there, but I've seen in Philippine media, specifically from the Philippine government media, that they are all trying to work something out. It's just kind of held up because they're going through elections right now. But yeah, it looks like basically everybody important, including almost the entire Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, is working on a trade deal, and you need that in order to achieve that, the substantial shift in supply chains that they're required to prepare for.
On that topic of supply chains, we have heard this. I don't know if it's a theory or it may be a real strategy. This quote unquote tariff wall, where the Trump administration, as a part of these negotiations with these Indo-Pacific countries, they're trying to get these Indo-Pacific countries to levy their own tariffs on Chinese goods. That seems a little implausible because so many of these smaller countries in the Indo-Pacific are actually reliant on the Chinese economy, whether they're primary exporters to China or also importers as well. Is there any, I don't want to say hope, but is there any likelihood that you think the Trump administration can actually get these countries to impose their own Chinese tariffs?
I do. It's not a quick solution. It's not an easy solution, but I think it will happen eventually. One of the biggest things that's going to help with that is the pass-throughs that you see China doing, where they put something into South Korea, say cool, made in South Korea, ship it off, avoid tariffs. South Korea is already looking into that. India's looking into steel it gets from Vietnam. Vietnam's looking into its own imports to check for pass-throughs. Everybody's kind of policing themselves to make sure that none of that happens. And at the same time, they're being forced to take a closer look at their trade with China. And in addition to that, all of these people have security issues with China, if not an outright territorial dispute. That eventually push will come to shove. And if you have to preference cheap Chinese stuff versus your sovereignty is eventually going to win out, and you need to actually establish that tariff wall ahead of time. It may not necessarily be as high as what the U.S. is doing, but I do expect that we'll see a lot of movement out of China and into these regions, followed by at least a small tariff, or maybe just a significant cessation of trade with China to kind of isolate them.
Right. As a reminder, something Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said last month: China's in a depression. We cannot let them export their way out of one. We'll see. By the way, these tariffs are not disappearing on China. We're just going back down to 30% or something like that. All right, thanks for that, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to our roll-ups. Robert, take it from the top.
So the U.S. Department of Agriculture said that they're going to suspend live cattle, horse, and bison imports to the southern border. And they said this is because the New World screwworms are rapidly expanding in Mexico. And USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins said that this is going to remain in effect until a significant window of containment is achieved. And Rollins had previously threatened this because Mexico was not allowing the USDA to fly equipment in to actually try to deal with this outbreak. And did announce a deal was made, but I haven't seen a public announcement that the deal fell through, but I think this is an indicator that it did. And this is a major issue for U.S. agriculture because screwworms could majorly impact ranchers in the United States. And then Texas governor.
And just real quick, is there any expected impact from this? Because I know we get beef from Mexico.
As far as I can tell, yeah, this is an immediate stop on all imports, including beef, at least live cattle, just due to how the impact of the screwworm could have on U.S. cattle populations. Mm-hmm. And then Texas Governor Greg Abbott said that Texas authorities and the Federal Department of Justice are investigating the construction of what's called the East Plano Islamic Center, or EPIC City. And this is that 400-acre Islamist residential development north of Dallas. And Abbott said that Texas authorities have also launched criminal investigations into this EPIC City construction. And then PJM Interconnection, which is the regional transmission organization that spans from New Jersey as far west as Illinois, parts of Illinois, and as far south as some northern parts of North Carolina, said that they're warning that extreme heat this summer could actually trigger power supply shortages for the first time across parts of the Mid-Atlantic into the Midwest. They said they expect to have enough electricity capacity to meet the typical summer demand, but that severe conditions could spike demand above what their spare supply through what they call demand response programs, which are contracts that require certain power generation facilities to provide. I think it was like 7.9 gigawatts of emergency power.
Mm-hmm. All right, and then PJM there on your screen, it's Pennsylvania, New Jersey, I guess at least parts of Virginia, West Virginia into Ohio, some other small parts of the Midwest. Have you seen anything from, I mean, it seems like every summer now, and we can look at falling margin power condition or power margin conditions where the excess electrical capacity is actually decreasing, not increasing. So we hear this every summer. And I just want to reiterate, this is PJM says they can handle normal summer conditions, but if we have an extended heat wave, this is what they're talking about, correct?
Correct. They point out the last time that they got close to shortages due to a heat wave I think was 2006, and they're expecting it to be the power demand to be just a little bit higher than that, and that would go above their spare generation resources.
Okay. Reserve power margins, I think it's a technical term. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. And let's go ahead and move on here through the rest of our roll-ups. Jared, I think we'll pitch it over to you to talk about the update for this India-Pakistan ceasefire.
Yes. President Trump announced on Saturday that his administration had brokered a ceasefire between India and Pakistan. And right off the bat, there were some immediate violations of the ceasefire, but I think that really came down to they just hadn't gotten word to the front lines yet. Because once those stopped, it stayed for the rest of the weekend. Both sides are claiming victory. It's over. the great Indo-Pakistani war is over. So,
well, I mean, for now,
yeah, for now, it will return again because you don't have 1,000 years of warfare and not see it come back. According to Secretary of State Rubio, India and Pakistan will also immediately begin new talks to settle, quote, a broad set of issues. He didn't specify the issues, but presumably there will be a much more finely recognized deal around the disputed territories.
Mm-hmm. On that point, Russian President Vladimir Putin is going to be in Turkey during the same time of that NATO ministers meeting.
I was just going to bring that up with the Ukraine-Russia deal. So Ukraine and Russia agreed to negotiate at least a ceasefire leading into peace in Turkey. There's some dispute on whether it's an immediate ceasefire or a negotiated ceasefire, but they're at least both meeting in Turkey on May 15th, which overlaps with the NATO informal foreign ministers meeting from the 14th to the 16th in Turkey. That to me looks like the NATO foreign ministers, along with Ukraine, are likely going to try to negotiate a ceasefire. And based on the reactions, because this all came from the Ukrainian side came from a Trump social media post where he accused both sides of trying to continue a bloodbath. Basically, you're both just war hungry. Neither one of them want that. They're both trying to portray themselves as peacemakers. frankly, I think this is gonna. I think I'm optimistic. I think something good will come out of this meeting.
Mhm. And we have heard from Zelensky. He said he's willing to meet directly with
Yeah.
Putin. I don't know if that's a good idea or not for Zelensky, but as because he doesn't hold the cards, as they say. So, all right, we'll see. So maybe like a U.S. Jared, just one point on this. It seems like a lot of these European NATO countries do not want the war to end, and I wonder at what point we could see maybe some friction induced by some of these NATO countries who actually do want to continue this proxy war against Russia.
I agree with that. However, they are threatening additional sanctions on Russia for as much good as it'll do if they don't take the ceasefire, if Russia doesn't take the ceasefire. So at least surface level, they are trying to say, hey, yeah, we want this to end. Honestly, it may be that they understand that Ukraine provides an existential threat to their population that allows them to increase defense spending.
Mm-hmm. All right. And then just to clarify here, this is a 30-day ceasefire, not an actual end to the war.
Correct. But it would be toward
right.
achieving an actual peace deal. So in theory, if you stop this, or if you achieve the ceasefire and actually achieve a peace deal in that 30 days, you achieved your peace earlier on. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of negotiating the terms of the peace.
Sure.
All right. And then moving on to Taiwan, speaking of, So the Taiwanese government plans to buy additional military equipment from the United States. We've covered an enormous amount of equipment that's already shown up this year and will continue to show up over the next 30 months. But they're wanting to buy more. They're currently in negotiation. The Ministry of National Defense for Taiwan is currently in negotiations with their legislature to find out how much they can buy, and with the United States to find out what they can buy for that price. They're trying to get $16.5 billion worth. Again, that's a low number, admittedly, but what they're trying to do is buy cheap, mass-produced weapons. So it would be a lot of low-cost weapons. That said, Taiwan is also one of the few places that actually maintains a budget surplus, so they are much more limited on what they can actually do with flexible money.
All right. Thanks for that, and let's go ahead and move on to the remainder of our items here. All right, let's head over to, what is this, New Jersey? Robert, this happened on Friday, and there was some commentary over the weekend. I think the big thing here is not just this event, but I think we have probably moved here from symbolic resistance to selective resistance. I'll make that case in just a second. Why don't you take us through the details of what's happened since Friday?
Yeah, so this was over that confrontation at the Newark, New Jersey ICE detention facility. And this involved not just the Newark mayor, who is Ross Baraka, but also Representatives Bonnie Watson-Coleman, Rob Menendez, and LaMonica McIver. And Department of Homeland Security said that they could face arrest after that confrontation. They also released some video that appears to show McIver what would normally be considered an assault of a law enforcement officer, I think, by a private citizen. And in response to this DHS statement, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Rep. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said that they want to defend lawmakers against what they're characterizing as ICE overreach, and that these ICE agents need to be identified immediately. And then Ocasio-Cortez also threatened DHS, saying, quote, "If you lay a finger on any of them," referencing these three representatives, "we are going to have a problem."
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, interesting. So, and listen, on this AOC thing, maybe this would have been a laughing matter a handful of years ago, but I was pretty shocked, as were many other people, when AOC and Bernie Sanders did this, the Fight Oligarchy tour or something like that, and they're drawing 30,000 people in like Utah and Idaho or somewhere around there. So I actually think this is fairly substantial. And also because AOC has actually been floated for far more prestigious roles within the Democrat Party. Some people are saying maybe a 2028 run. I tend to doubt that, but we'll see. This is important. This event specifically is important because there have been protests, I think, for like a couple of weeks now. There were protests outside this ICE facility in New Jersey. And now we have this confrontation here between ICE agents and these members of Congress. This is a pretty significant escalation here. When we look at this, if our key assumption is that these left-wing groups, and we're talking about mainly progressive left-wing groups, we're not talking about the far left revolutionary groups, but these groups like 5051 and Indivisible and the Normeisens of the left, if our key assumption is that they are planning for or trying to build the capability up to a popular revolution or color revolution, which is what some people call it, then we have basically this ladder of escalation. And it begins with symbolic resistance. These are the protests, which have been large. They've been pretty toothless. That April 5th, the hands-off protest, maybe got 3 million people nationwide. Each successive day of protests beyond that has been smaller, substantially smaller. Now they're talking about the May Day protests on Thursday and maybe over the weekend only getting like maybe tens of thousands of protesters turning out, which is a fraction of what they wanted. So they have to move from these toothless protests into what's called direct action. And that's stuff like civil disobedience, occupations, where they move from the sidelines of protesting to trying to directly intervene and stop some of these Trump policies. I think in 2017, we saw an occupation of the ICE headquarters in D.C. So that is an example of direct action. So I think they are looking now because they have sustained protests, these large progressive left organizations. That will obviously not work. President Trump does not care about protests. So I think they're in a situation where they say, well, we have to escalate now. As Senator Chris Murphy said back in late March, we have to take, quote unquote, exceptional measures or use exceptional methods or tactics to oppose the Trump administration. So back then I started talking about this pyramid, and you have symbolic resistance, which are the toothless protests. You build up a certain base layer and you have enough agitated people who realize protests are not going to work. Protests are not going to move the needle. Therefore, we have to escalate. And then we are on the very bottom layer, I think now, of selective resistance. So I think we'll actually see more direct action ramp up, getting into the summer protest and riot season. And then eventually where they want to get is to mass resistance. They want, they don't just want these isolated incidents. They want thousands or tens of thousands or more, hundreds of thousands of people engaging in these occupations and these strategic use of direct action. And then when you do that, typically you get a crackdown. Somewhere in this, you will probably see a series of crackdowns. Maybe I know President Trump has previously talked about invoking the Insurrection Act. I think that would be a mistake. I think that is far more likely to fuel more opposition rather than quell it or calm it. But we may be looking at that in the next year or two, or maybe at some time before 2028. Point is, we're up on this next rung, and so I think we're going to start seeing more, as Chris Murphy says, more exceptional tactics. Robert, do you have anything to add there?
Well, on the idea of the Insurrection Act, I think that's correct. Is that it would actually exacerbate the situation. And I think that is the intended response to the more direct action protests, like the going to these ICE detention facilities, saying that you're conducting oversight in order to get in, and trying to bait or hopefully, in their mind, I think hopefully get some kind of response from the Trump administration. And that's a normal unconventional warfare tactic, is to invite an overreach from the state. And I think in this case that's probably along the lines of what they want out of any kind of direct action protest, like an occupation of an ICE facility, or in this confrontation on Friday, is to elicit an overreach.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. All right, let's move on here. All right, Jared, let's talk about this thing, because there are what, 4 ongoing ceasefires now, it looks like, trying to be brokered by the Trump administration. Why don't you go ahead?
Yes. So we covered India. We covered Houthi last week. They'll no longer be shooting at America. The it looks like there's one being negotiated with Hamas. Hamas is claiming that they have direct negotiations with the United States now, which previously they were going indirect. They also, as we covered, released an American hostage. And there are nuclear negotiations going on with Iran. Those have largely been indirect, but Iran says that they're at least considering a quote adjusting the level of confidence building with the United States. Basically, we want to get to a point where we can talk to each other directly. That's movement of the ball, even if it's not a huge concrete positive result. At the same time, there's the Russia-Ukraine ceasefire going on, and then there's there are quite a few little details around the Middle East that also appear to be achieving ceasefires, even though it's not necessarily related to Trump. Like the PKK and Turks said that they would stop fighting. But overall, this appears to be a massive diplomatic push for peace in the Middle East and its adjacent regions, which, as we were talking about before the show, China a couple of years ago was saying, yeah, the U.S. is nothing but a warmonger. They're going to exacerbate all the wars. China is peacemaker. Well, Trump's countering that. Plain and simple, that is what's happening. He's countering that peacemaker status for China because China's not involved in any of these so far.
Yeah, this goes back to when China brokered that peace deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I think everyone was shocked. I don't think anyone really expected that. And we started hearing about the end of U.S. and this was under Biden, by the way, the end of U.S. exceptionalism, and China's the peacemaker, and they have the Global Security Initiative. And this is something that was launched by Xi Jinping back in 2022. He said, the world is he didn't say cruise ship, but basically said the world is a cruise ship and all the countries are its passengers. And you can't just throw some member of the cruise ship overboard. And of course, he's talking about Russia. He says, we've got to keep everyone on this cruise ship. And that was it. Like, that was like the beginning of the end for U.S. power and influence abroad. A pretty welcome sign that Trump, I think, is probably reversing that here.
Absolutely.
All right. And last thing here, if you are all these countries, I think the last thing that you want, especially if you're Turkey or India, especially, the last thing you want is to have these kind of internecine conflicts with your neighbors in a period where the United States may actually go to war with China, maybe by the end of the decade. So this also seems like a lot of countries are pretty incentivized to bring about an end to these conflicts. There's no sense in having much greater disruption at home, especially when something so large is being waged abroad. All right, with that, Jared, any other comments there?
I think you're exactly right. And when you mentioned, internecine conflicts with the regions, one of the things that constantly stuck out to me was the Iran-India port development, which is a diplomatic that's a very big issue if China and the U.S. go to blows, because India is with the U.S. and Iran is with China, and they have to cross Pakistan at the same time. So if that war is there, it's a diplomatic mess if those maintain. So peace in this region actually would help develop Iran, which potentially would bring it away from China.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we're just about to get to your questions. Jared, just one last point on this Israel thing. I've also been very surprised at this diplomatic row here between the United States and Israel, especially when Mike Huckabee, who isn't he the ambassador to Israel?
Yeah,
just countless. I don't know. I see him on these commercials occasionally when I watch Fox News, or previously I did, and he's shilling for Israel. And even he came out, and I don't know if he said this of his own volition or is basically forced into it by the White House, but he said, we don't need Israeli permission to make our own peace treaties with people at war with Israel. I thought that was pretty shocking here.
Yeah. That is a very important aspect to bring into focus. The deals with Hamas and Iran and the Houthis, all of those are those parties with the U.S., not those parties with Israel. It looks like the U.S. is going to let Israel handle its own foreign policy for a while.
Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the push pull of Israel wanting security guarantees to go to war with Iran. I mean, we talked about there was an explosion in an Iranian port, and anytime you have a head scratcher, something explodes in Iran. Like, okay, I mean, it's not like the Chinese or Russians doing that. So, so it just seems like there's a lot of push and pull where Israel's trying to push to do more, get the United States to go to war with Iran, and the Trump administration is trying to pull back from that. Maybe that explains kind of the bottom that and this the Israeli conquest plan, where they basically said, "Hey, we're just going to go all the way into Gaza and we're going to occupy it." And any updates on that? Because that's something we talked about last week. Israel's calling up tens of thousands of reservists. You had these war plans that were approved by the Israeli Knesset or whoever they were approved by, and it looks like the next leg of the war in Gaza.
I saw that they had talked about it again at their security meeting. They said when they started it that after Trump's trip to the Middle East here, they would start it. So by the end of the week, we should know whether or not they're going to actually move on Gaza there. There was a lesser minister that made some interesting comments about who would actually occupy it. Like after the IDF clears everybody out, settles it, rebuilds it, who would occupy it? I don't have a clear answer on where exactly they intend to get the people for this. So once I do, I will start actually pushing on that.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. And as always, if you do have questions, go ahead and put them into the chat. If you start your comment with a capital Q, then you'll help us find those questions much sooner. All right. Any idea why the screwworm issue is being dealt with now when Michael Yon and Laura Loomer reported this 4 years ago?
Yeah, the Rollins in that press release from the USDA said that they're detecting that screwworm outbreak traveling further north from it's mostly around the Mexico-Panama border where it's been contained previously, and now they're saying it's spreading closer and closer to the U.S. border. So that's why now they're taking actions to cut off those imports.
All right. Great to know. Thanks for that. Let's move on to the next question. If this U.S.-China trade deal is the real deal, does that indicate China is choosing a more patient timeline with Taiwan and thus suspend or push back a potential confrontation? I think China's obviously coming to the table because the trade war has induced a substantial amount of economic pain. We heard about, I don't know if this is true or not, but protests by these factory workers in China because they're not being paid, because their factories are not making anything, because we are not buying anything from them. And so we're seeing a lot of, I go back, I've talked about this Deutsche Bank report where you have a bunch of financial analysts and money managers go to China, and they said in every meeting with their Chinese clients, they're talking about buying physical gold. Everyone wants to buy gold. China's been buying gold for 18 plus months now. And so I think there's just a lot of economic and financial uncertainty. They're still going through somewhat of an economic collapse. They're trying to get their way out of this deflationary recession / depression. And they have to export things because that is how they make money. And so when the United States accounts for 15% or something like that of Chinese exports, that's a pretty important export market. Jared, what does this deal, or does it have any impact on China's designs on Taiwan?
I don't think it'll make an impact on it, but I do think it is an important indicator that I think it's an important indicator that they intend to at least try to keep the timeline, because as you mentioned, Scott Bessent mentioning, they have to export their way out of this. They need a strong economy in order to fund their military. If they cannot be militarily ready by 2027, which is 18 months away, if they are still recovering from a recession, which I believe you said in the past takes a year to fully recover on average. Is that about right?
Well, I mean, for like a U.S. recession,
yeah. Well,
the average length of a U.S. recession is like 10 or 11 months. China's been having problems for years now. Their road to recovery. I mean, the Chinese government has just been issuing so much stimulus, trying to get these economic green shoots going again, and they have not been successful so far.
Right. So they need as much time as possible to try to get a good economy, to fund a military action that is less than 2 years away. I think the fact that they came to this table means that they're trying to actually keep that timeline, not that they're trying to extend the timeline.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. And when you look at U.S. recessions too, a lot of them are structural from the boom bust cycle. You know, the Fed hikes interest rates, you get an economic slowdown. The Fed cuts interest rates, you get growth going again. It's a cycle. This problem in China, I don't think is cyclical. This is not just like kind of a textbook recession. This has to do with overproduction, overcapacity, and it is not a. They built too much stuff, and there's not enough people to buy it, and so at any rate, including like cities and apartment buildings and condos and homes and all sorts of stuff. So, all right, let's move on here. Next question. Chinese political leaders are notoriously dishonest. Is Trump proceeding with a don't trust and verify mindset? How will an agreement be maintained? So this is interesting because we heard from Scott Bessent over the weekend, U.S. Treasury Secretary, that I think he said something like he's actually optimistic that there will be a Chinese purchasing agreement as a part of this negotiation where China will commit to purchasing so much stuff from the United States. That was pretty famously part of the phase 1 trade deal the last time around. China did not follow through on that. They basically just pedaled their feet, and then Biden won the 2020 election. He won, and then China didn't follow through on those purchase agreements. So is there, Jared, have you seen anything here that would signal that the Trump administration has been what's it fool me once kind of thing?
Yeah, I think the question's right on the money where it's don't trust and verify, and the reason for that is like take into account what's happened over the past couple of months. The Trump administration came out swinging, hit with 145% tariffs, and we've walked it back. China knows now the administration's serious. They will do this again. And so all of these, we'll reduce, they are suspended, not cut. That's telling the Chinese, we will do this again if we need to. You will hold up your end of the bargain. So are the Chinese political leaders notoriously dishonest? And would they go back on it? Absolutely. No doubt in my mind. But you also just showed them, we have a sword, we're willing to use it. You will cooperate. That kind of leaves the ball in America's court to dictate terms.
Mm-hmm. All right, next question. Doesn't escalation increase the risk to direct action participants and drive them beyond the threshold of garnering serious law enforcement attention, even without Trump policy changes? All right, so I guess this is in regard to the Trump resistance 2.0. I think the whole argument here, and we can see this again, Senator Chris Murphy said exactly this in a town hall meeting in late March. He's a Democrat senator from Connecticut. And he said, we have not taken enough risk. And he's talking about, he said, in so many words, he says, Democrat politicians need to take greater risks and show the rank and file, show the activists, show the protesters that Democrat leadership is willing to take more risks. And that opens the door to the rank and file, to the activists, the organizers, the protesters to also take more risk. And so this seems to be like a kind of like you have to get Democrat politicians to lead from the front of this pack in order to encourage more direct action and more risk taking by the rank and file. So I think that's what's going on here. And in terms of escalation, increasing the risk to the participants, yes, that is kind of the point. As Robert said, you want an overreaction. You want the Trump administration to invoke the Insurrection Act, or to talk about removing habeas corpus or something like that. You want something extreme. You want images of National Guard troops in the streets, and you want to cause outrage. You want to use it's agitprop. It's just agitation propaganda. You want these images. You want a Kent State. You want a something that just agitates and enrages more people. That is how they advance the movement from here. And the whole goal is, if you induce enough friction If you have enough occupations, enough protests, enough direct action, enough civil disobedience, it's like just like in 2020, and you have these people who are protesting and they're getting pepper sprayed by police. And we just saw that, like a shotgun blast across the media for weeks and months on end. And someone saw that and they bring attention to it. This is one of the big things about these organized protests. After that hands-off protest on April the 5th, and then you have the April 19th day of protest or day of action as well. One of the biggest complaints is that the media is not covering this. We're not getting traction in the media. And so the reason why you escalate to direct action is you force the media to cover it. And now you put those images in front of more eyeballs and you activate more people who say, this isn't right. The Trump regime, they're fascists. They actually are fascists this time. And I'm going to go help and do something about it. So this is the whole part of like trying to build momentum. You've got to get media coverage. You've got to do more extreme things. You have to escalate beneath the threshold of violence in most cases. That's where they want it. So beneath the threshold of definitely armed violence, but you have to cause an overreaction. That's the only way that you're going to be able to advance your movement is through crackdowns. And so that's what they're trying to push right now. So I hope that answers your question. Are there any estimates on approximately how many people would participate in selective resistance or mass resistance? And is there an estimate state by state? I don't have an estimate, but we can see who's engaging in direct action right now. It's a few dozen in a handful of cases. It's a few dozen Antifa affinity groups, like this University of Washington occupation that happened last week. And then there's a handful like Frederick, Maryland, Salem, Oregon. I think were a couple other places where Antifa Black Bloc showed up on May Day or in conjunction with some sort of May Day protest. In terms of selective resistance, in the beginning, it's going to be the low dozens. But this is something that can cascade very quickly, because if there is some kind of event, you want images in the media, and you want these events to radicalize more people. I think that Wisconsin judge that was arrested radicalized more people. The arrest of the Newark, New Jersey mayor radicalized more people, at least on a local level. If these members of Congress do end up being arrested by ICE agents or FBI or Marshal Service or whoever, that will probably definitely radicalize more people. So in the beginning, it's small, and I definitely can't have a state by state, but I think the best way to do this is look up the turnout on April 5th, April 19th, and May 1st. Those are those 3 days of action. And I think maybe April 27th or somewhere around there, 50-51, try to do one. Get a baseline protest turnout and then figure out what 0.5% of that is. So do the math. And I think that's probably like a pretty good baseline starting out, just as an initial estimate. It may not be entirely accurate, but that's probably the best estimate you can make. All right, last question here. Will the Macron, Starmer, Mers, cocaine gate go anywhere, or is it illicit drug use by heads of state no longer noteworthy? I don't know. Jared, Robert, I saw the NATO people saying this is a Russian talking point. You can look at the picture. Is it a napkin? Is it a bag of cocaine? I don't know. Do y'all have an opinion one way or the other?
I don't think it'll go anywhere. They're heads of state. Like who's going to prosecute them?
Cares. Yeah, nobody cares.
Yeah, I agree. I saw it. I didn't think it didn't move the needle for me. I don't think anything's going to happen because of it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks y'all. Thanks for watching. We appreciate your support. We do this Monday through Friday. So if it's your first time, welcome. If you're an old timer, we're glad you're here. This is the end of the morning briefing, but the show goes on over on the app. You can join a network of information sharers, sharing information reports all throughout the day over on the Early Warning Network app. By the way, we've got to start scheduling some state level meetups or I don't know. We're going to do something to help facilitate more local and state level connection for information sharing. So stay tuned. Everyone have a great rest of your day. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.